A racist man humiliates a black girl in a store, demanding she leave what he claims is his space. But when her father, the real owner, steps forward, the revelation leaves him utterly speechless and facing a truth he cannot escape. The doorbell chimed softly as 10-year-old Ayana stepped into the small family-owned store she visited often with her father. It was a typical afternoon, the kind where she enjoyed wandering the aisles and marveling at the world through her youthful eyes. Today she carried a list from her father, James, a quiet but firm man who had worked tirelessly to build the store into a cornerstone of the community. Ayana's presence was as warm as the sunlight spilling through the large front windows. She greeted Mrs. Johnson, the elderly cashier who always saved her the best candies, and flashed her a smile that could brighten the gloomiest day. But the peace of the moment shattered when a tall, middle-aged man entered behind her, his presence casting a shadow over the store's inviting atmosphere. The man, later identified as Carl, glanced around with an air of authority that didn't belong to him. His eyes landed on Ayana, and his expression twisted into disdain. She had done nothing but exist in that space. Yet to Carl, her very presence seemed an affront. He strode toward her, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. "Hey, kid," he barked, his voice echoing through the aisles. Ayana turned, clutching the small shopping basket tighter in her hands. "What are you doing here?" Ayana blinked, unsure how to respond. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't your place. Don't you have somewhere else to go?" Tears welled in Ayana's eyes as she looked up at him, her young mind struggling to process why this man was speaking to her with such anger. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her face etched with concern, but Carl raised a hand to silence her. "Stay out of this," he warned. The air grew heavy with tension as other customers froze in place, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. Carl's voice grew louder, his words laced with venom. "You people think you can just waltz into places where you don't belong? This is a respectable establishment." Ayana's voice trembled as she tried to explain. "But "No buts," Carl interrupted, pointing toward the door. "Leave. Now." The store fell silent, save for the sound of Ayana's shaky breaths. Her heart raced, her mind grappling with emotions she couldn't name. Fear, shame, confusion. She felt small, helpless, and exposed under Carl's harsh gaze. Just then, the sound of a door creaking open from the back of the store broke the silence. The heavy footsteps that followed carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. Everyone turned to see James emerge, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with a quiet fury. James walked with measured steps, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. The store, once filled with warmth, now felt heavy with tension. Every pair of eyes in the room followed him as he approached Carl, who still stood over Ayana, with a smug expression plastered across his face. Ayana turned to her father, relief washing over her as she rushed to his side. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. James gently placed a hand on her shoulder, silently assuring her that everything would be okay. "Is there a problem here?" James asked, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to command respect. Carl turned to James, his expression darkening as he took in the man's appearance. Dressed in simple work attire, James didn't look like the man Carl expected to see in charge of anything. "There's a problem," Carl sneered. "This kid doesn't belong here, and you shouldn't let her wander around unsupervised. She's bothering people." James tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at Ayana, whose tear-streaked face broke his heart, then back at Carl. "She's not bothering anyone," James said evenly. "She's here to pick up some items for her family." Carl scoffed, crossing his arms. "This isn't some free-for-all. People like her shouldn't just come in and act like they own the place." His words were venomous, laced with the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unchecked prejudice. James's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He glanced around the store, noticing how the other customers were frozen, watching, but doing nothing. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had always been a kind presence, stood silent behind the counter, her face pale with unease. James knelt beside Ayana, his voice soft as he spoke to her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" She nodded hesitantly, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "I didn't do anything wrong, Daddy," she whispered. "You didn't," James reassured her, his voice steady. He rose to his full height and turned back to Carl, his eyes locking onto the man's. She's not going anywhere, James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Carl's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his attempt to intimidate clear. "Oh, really? And who are you to say so?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. James stared at him for a moment, then took a step back, gesturing toward the shelves stocked with goods, the polished floors, and the signs carefully placed throughout the store. "I'm the owner," James said simply. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Carl's face froze, his smirk slipping as confusion and disbelief flickered across his features. "You?" he spat, the word loaded with incredulity. "You're the owner of this place?" James nodded, his calm never wavering. "That's right. My name is James Carter. I built this store from the ground up. Every shelf, every aisle, every inch of this place. I made it what it is today. And Ayana," he said, glancing down at his daughter with pride in his eyes, "isn't just welcome here. She belongs here more than anyone else." Carl took a step back, his confidence faltering. The realization of his mistake began to settle in, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "Well, I didn't know," he muttered, his tone defensive. "How was I supposed to know?" James crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "You didn't ask. You didn't take a moment to think before you humiliated my daughter in front of all these people. You just assumed you had the right to tell her she didn't belong." The weight of James's words made Carl shift uncomfortably, but he still refused to look at Ayana, who now stood a little straighter beside her father. "Apologize," James said firmly. Carl blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," James replied, his voice like steel. "Apologize to my daughter, right now." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Every eye in the store was fixed on Carl, who stood frozen, his face a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and defiance. Apologizing, especially in public, was something he wasn't used to, and it showed. His pride wrestled with the growing realization that he was out of line, but his ego refused to back down. "I don't owe anyone an apology," Carl muttered, his voice low but defiant. James didn't flinch. His steady gaze bore into Carl, speaking volumes without saying a word. After a long pause, James finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "Let me make this clear. What you said to my daughter was wrong. You humiliated a child in front of everyone in this store because of your assumptions. That's not just disrespectful, it's cruel." Ayana clutched her father's hand tightly, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. James's words weren't just for Carl. They were for everyone watching. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at Carl, others looking down at their shoes. The silence in the room wasn't just awkward, it was complicit. Carl's jaw clenched as he glanced around, realizing the weight of the stares now directed at him. The righteousness he had felt moments ago was slipping away, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation, shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. James stepped closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "My daughter deserves better. She deserves respect. And if you can't give her that, you can leave my store right now." Carl's eyes flickered with something unspoken. Fear, perhaps, or the realization that he was now the one unwelcome. He shifted uncomfortably, the confidence he'd carried into the store now crumbling under the weight of his mistake. "I didn't mean to upset anyone," Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not enough," James replied sharply. "It's not about what you meant, it's about what you did. So I'll ask you one more time. Apologize to my daughter." The words hung in the air, a final ultimatum that demanded resolution. Carl hesitated, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. Finally, he turned toward Ayana, his posture stiff and his expression strained. "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words forced and hollow. James held up a hand, stopping him. "That's not good enough. Look her in the eye and mean it." Carl's face flushed a deep red as he met Ayana's gaze for the first time. Her big, tear-filled eyes stared back at him, not with hatred, but with a quiet strength that belied her age. Something in that moment broke through Carl's defenses, and his next words came softer, quieter, and with a hint of sincerity. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time holding her gaze. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Ayana didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her small frame still trembling, but her chin lifted slightly higher. James exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening. "Good," he said simply. "Now, if there's nothing else, I suggest you leave." Carl didn't argue. He glanced at the faces surrounding him, none of them offering support or sympathy. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His shoulders slumped as he disappeared into the sunlight. The store was silent for a moment longer, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. Then slowly the tension began to dissipate. Mrs. Johnson stepped out from behind the counter, her hands wringing nervously. "James, she started, but James held up a hand. "Don't," he said softly, though his tone was not unkind. "I know you wanted to help, but next time don't stay silent. Silence gives people like him permission." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. James looked down at Ayanna, his expression softening. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice wavered as she replied, "I am now." James knelt beside her, placing both hands gently on her shoulders. "You were so brave," he said. "What happened today wasn't your fault, and I'm so proud of you for standing tall." Ayanna wrapped her arms around her father, burying her face in his chest. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. James held her close, his eyes closing as he whispered back, "I love you too, baby girl. Always." As the door closed behind Carl, a collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the store. The tension that had gripped the room loosened, but in its place came a new awareness. A quiet reckoning. The customers who had witnessed the exchange began to murmur among themselves, their voices tinged with guilt, admiration, and for some, a lingering discomfort. One man, standing near the shelves of canned goods, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Hey, James," he said hesitantly. "That was something. I should have spoken up. You didn't," James interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "But now you know better. Next time, don't wait for someone else to do what's right." The man nodded solemnly, his cheeks flushing with shame. "You're right. I'm sorry." James offered a small nod, acknowledging the apology. Around the room, others chimed in, expressing their support for James and Ayanna. A young woman, holding a toddler on her hip, approached Ayanna with a kind smile. "You're a brave girl," she said softly. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Ayanna looked up at the woman, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steadier now. Word about the incident spread quickly. By the next morning, the story was being shared across town, each retelling amplifying the message of James's quiet strength and Carl's humiliating defeat. The store, which had always been a local hub, now became a symbol of standing up against prejudice. James was no stranger to the whispers and stares of those who underestimated him. When he first opened the store, he had faced skepticism and doubt, not just because he was a black man in a predominantly white town, but because people couldn't imagine someone like him succeeding. But James had proven them wrong. Now, as more people stopped by the store to show their support, James felt something shift. This wasn't just about what happened with Carl, it was about a community realizing it could be better. One day, a local reporter arrived with a notepad and a camera. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity, "the town's buzzing about what happened the other day. Would you mind sharing your side of the story?" James hesitated. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he glanced at Ayanna, who was stocking shelves with a quiet confidence she hadn't had before. He realized this wasn't just his story, it was hers too. "I'll share," he said, stepping forward. "But only if you include one thing. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one, especially children, ever feels like they don't belong." As the reporter began her interview, Ayanna stayed close to her father, listening intently. Finally, the reporter turned to her and asked, "Ayanna, how did it feel when your father stood up for you?" Ayanna looked at her father, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "It felt safe," she said after a moment. "He always tells me that no one can take away who I am, and he showed me that he meant it." Her words struck a chord with everyone present. James placed a hand on her shoulder, pride evident in his expression. "She's stronger than she knows," he said softly. The story was published a few days later, and it resonated far beyond their small town. People from neighboring communities, and even further afield, began visiting the store, not just to shop, but to thank James and Ayana for their courage. Letters and emails poured in, each one expressing admiration for the way they had handled the situation. In the weeks following the incident, the store transformed into more than a place to buy groceries. It became a gathering spot for the community. People from all walks of life stopped by, not just to shop, but to talk, to share their own stories of prejudice and resilience. Conversations that had once been avoided now took place in the aisles, sparked by the bravery of a father and his daughter. James found himself busier than ever, balancing the responsibilities of running the store with the newfound role of being a community leader. Ayana, too, seemed to walk with a renewed sense of confidence. She still stocked shelves and greeted customers, but her smile now carried a quiet strength, a reminder of her father's unwavering belief in her. One afternoon, as James was rearranging the produce section, Ayana approached him with a notebook in hand. "Daddy," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Look at this." James wiped his hands on a towel and crouched down to her level. "What's this, sweetheart?" he asked, taking the notebook from her. "I've been writing stories," Ayana said proudly, "about what happened that day and about how you stood up for me. I want other kids to know they're not alone, that they can be brave too." James flipped through the notebook, his chest tightening with pride. The pages were filled with Ayana's neat handwriting and colorful drawings, each one telling a story of courage and kindness. "These are amazing, Ayana," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got a gift," she beamed. "Do you think I could share them with people?" James smiled, his heart swelling. "I think the world would be lucky to read what you've written." A few days later, the doorbell chimed, and James looked up to see an all-too-familiar face standing in the doorway. It was Carl. Unlike his last visit, Carl's demeanor was subdued, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a heavy weight. The store fell silent as everyone noticed him, the memory of his actions still fresh in their minds. Carl hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and walked toward the counter where James stood. "Mr. Carter," Carl began, his voice low. I wanted to apologize. Properly this time." James studied him carefully, his face unreadable. The store was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the background. "I didn't realize what I was doing," Carl continued, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I acted out of ignorance and, well, I was wrong. I'm sorry for what I said to your daughter and to you." James let the silence stretch for a moment, considering Carl's words. Finally, he spoke. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong," he said, his voice steady. "But an apology only matters if it's followed by change. So, what are you going to do about it?" Carl blinked, surprised by the question. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly grappling with the weight of the challenge. After a long pause, he nodded. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out. And I'll do better." James nodded, his expression softening slightly. "That's a start." Carl looked over at Ayana, who stood quietly beside her father. "Ayana," he said, his voice trembling, "I am so sorry for how I treated you. You didn't deserve that." "No one does." Ayana hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly. As Carl left the store, the air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. James turned to Ayana, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "Did you mean what you said, Daddy?" she asked. "That it takes courage to admit when you're wrong?" James smiled and crouched down to meet her gaze. "I did," he said, "but it takes even more courage to make things right. That's what we'll keep doing, no matter what." In the months that followed, Ayana's stories gained attention beyond the town. With James's help, she began sharing her writings with schools and community centers, inspiring children and adults alike to stand up for what's right. The store continued to thrive, not just as a business, but as a symbol of resilience, unity, and hope. For Ayana, that day in the store became a defining moment, not because of the pain it caused, but because of the strength it revealed. And for James, it was a reminder of the legacy he was building for his daughter, one of courage, dignity, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves respect. As the sun set on the small town one evening, James and Ayana stood outside the store, watching the light fade into the horizon. "We did good, didn't we, Daddy?" Ayana asked, leaning against him. "We did," James replied, wrapping an arm around her. "And we're just getting started."